There's a new saying in law enforcement circles these days, don't do the crime if your brother's doing time. And the reason for that is the power of DNA. Every state in this country collects DNA from convicted felons and loads it into computer databases, all connected together by the FBI. When detectives find DNA at a crime scene, they run it through that database looking for a perfect match. You see this on crime shows all the time. But sometimes a search yields a near or partial match, in which case it's clear the felon in the database did not commit the crime, but the DNA is so similar, maybe their father, mother, or brother did, which raises a dilemma. Should police start investigating those family members, or is that going too far?
These are important scientific leads that need to be run down, and the fact that we can't run them down in this country, I think, is shameful.
Mitch Morrissey, the district attorney of Denver, Colorado, runs one of the most aggressive cold case projects in the country. On 3 separate occasions over the last few years, his team ran DNA from unsolved rapes through the DNA database and came up with partial hits.
In these situations, it wasn't a perfect match.
But close?
Yes, very close.
In all 3 cases, very close.
Right.
Morrissey wanted the names of those felons so he could investigate their family members. But he was told that FBI policy prohibits states from sharing names with one another unless it's a perfect match.
This isn't car break-ins. These are the type of people that will attack women and continually do it until you catch them. And I think that the FBI, my office, the Denver Police Department, owe it to victims and potential victims to run down these leads.
This is what the DNA profile looks like.
We asked Angelo Delamana, head of DNA analysis for the state of Alabama, for a crash course in how DNA profiles and matches work. So this is just one person?
It is. This is the DNA profile of one individual, and you can see how there's 2 traits at every one.
These peaks or alleles, 13 pairs of them, are then represented as numbers. 1 number in each pair comes from the mother, 1 from the father. When you look at this, can you tell me what color eyes that person has, or how tall they are, anything like that?
No, not at all. The areas that we look at are commonly referred to as in the junk DNA.
Junk?
Junk DNA,
Oh.
yes.
When Delamana runs a sample from a crime scene through the DNA database and gets a perfect match, the numbers are identical in both profiles. But sometimes he gets a partial match where all but a few numbers are the same.
These partial matches kind of hit you between the eyes, and you say, well, it's obviously not this person. But when you look at the profile as a whole, there's a lot of sharing there.
Yeah.
Statistically, there's a strong likelihood that you're looking at the biological relative of the rapist or the source of this crime scene sample.
Criminologists have long known that crime tends to run in families. One study found that 51% of inmates in state prisons had a family member who had also been incarcerated. In fact, a statistical analysis last year in the journal Science found that if we used our DNA database to deliberately look for family members, it could yield 40% more hits.
Now you're subjecting a whole new class of innocent people to genetic surveillance by the government.
Stephen Mercer is a Maryland attorney who specializes in issues involving DNA.
With this new technology, no one has ever considered, well, if my brother's DNA ends up in a database and he's forfeited his privacy rights by becoming a convicted felon, has he also forfeited my privacy rights as well as a wholly innocent family member? That puts me under lifelong genetic surveillance.
The other side of the argument is that this is genetic surveillance and that it invades innocent people's privacy, and that this is America and we don't do that.
Let me give you an example. Say we have a hit-and-run accident where someone is killed, and we have witnesses that say, this is the color of the car, this is the style of the car, but I only got the first 3 license plate numbers.
Partial.
Only a partial. What should the police do? Just say, oh no, it's only partial, so we're not going to do anything? Or should they go to your motor vehicle database, and they may talk to 20 people that weren't involved in the accident at all, And I'll tell you, most of those people are going to tell you, thanks for looking into this because we hope you solve the case.
Of course they're going to come up with analogies that seem to do away with any sense of wrongdoing or any sense of violation of privacy by the government. So they say, oh, well, this is like a partial plate, and we're just following up on these leads in a
And
sort
what's
of
wrong
normal...
with that?
Because it's not a partial plate. We're talking about DNA. DNA is different. DNA contains a vast amount of intensely personal information.
And he says there are serious racial implications, because since blacks are overrepresented in the prisons, and therefore in the DNA database, extending it to relatives would magnify the disparity.
What you're going to end up seeing is nearly the majority of the African American population being under genetic surveillance.
The majority.
If you do the math, that's where you end up.
Extremely specific question. You have a crime lab looking at DNA in a horrific crime. They get a partial match, a very close match, and the DNA expert suspects a brother. Should he withhold that information from the police, or should he tell the police, we think a brother did this?
If it comes from a database search,
Yes.
then it should not be revealed.
So that the DNA expert should just say, sorry, no match, and that's the end of it, and not pass this incredible clue along.
That's correct.
I have a big problem with that. They have this information, and they're not telling the lead investigators. How do they justify that to the next victim of this serial rapist?
Morrissey thinks the U.S. should do what the Brits are doing. They have developed a technique to scour their DNA database, deliberately searching for partial matches that might indicate a relative. It's called familial searching. And the city of Rotherham used it to try and catch a criminal who had eluded police for 20 years. Back in the 1980s, he was called the shoe rapist because of the pattern of his attacks.
It was a lone female walking home. Invariably, they were wearing stiletto shoes. They were tied up using stockings, and their shoes were always stolen.
Detective Sue Hickman was given a list of 43 people in the area who could have been related to the rapist. The third door she knocked on belonged to June Lloyd, whose DNA was in the database because of a DUI arrest.
What did you say to her?
We're running a cold case investigation, and there are some similarities between your DNA and the offender's DNA. Do you mind telling me, have you got any brothers? And she said, yes. She said, I've got a brother, but it won't be my brother, he's a businessman.
Her brother James was a manager at this print shop. Married with children, he had no criminal record. But when his sister called and told him about Hickman's visit, he became suicidal, and his family called the police. Underneath a trap door at his office, police discovered this.
Oh, my goodness.
More than 100 women's shoes,
This is stunning.
all worn, all different sizes, all stiletto heels. DNA testing confirmed James Lloyd was the shoe rapist.
You visited 3 people
Yeah.
and solved the crime
Yeah.
in 8 hours.
In 8 hours, yeah.
You think this should be a national policy, familial searching?
Absolutely. There should be a familial searching policy that is constitutional and legal in the United States.
Darrell Hunt in Winston-Salem, North Carolina would agree, and not just for its potential to catch criminals, but for its power to set innocent people free. 23 years ago, Winston-Salem was shaken by a brutal killing. A young newspaper editor named Deborah Sykes was dragged to this grassy area, raped and stabbed 16 times. Although there was little to go on, Darrell Hunt was charged with first-degree murder.
Did they have a fingerprint?
No,
Did they have any blood?
no.
Did they have any semen?
They had semen, but it didn't match me.
Didn't match his blood type. And yet Hunt was convicted and sentenced to life. 10 years later, when DNA testing came along, it showed he was not the rapist. But to Hunt's astonishment, the judge said he still could have committed the murder and sent him right back to prison. He spent another 9 years behind bars before the state ran the DNA from the crime scene through North Carolina's database. And that's when things got interesting. They got what seemed to be a hit to a convicted felon named Anthony Brown, but the sample was so old it was degraded, and the result inconclusive. So they flew the sample to Angelo Delamana's state-of-the-art lab in Alabama, which produced a clear profile that revealed that Anthony Brown was not the rapist.
You see here how the donor of the semen is a 1920, but he's a 1723.
Right,
so
that one alone
that one by
excludes
itself, he's
Yeah.
out.
But the two profiles were remarkably close.
Of the 26 alleles that are in the crime scene sample, this individual shares 20.
What do you say to yourself?
Biological brother, full SIP.
Delamana told his counterparts in North Carolina that they might want to check and see if Anthony Brown had any brothers. FBI policy doesn't prohibit a state from pursuing a partial match within its own borders. What he heard back the next day was not what he expected.
He has 11 brothers.
His 11 brothers.
6 of those brothers were deceased. However, there was one brother who was in a neighboring county on a misdemeanor parole violation.
The investigators' next move was right out of CSI.
They offered him a cigarette. He took that cigarette and then finished the interview, and they took that cigarette butt to the laboratory, ran that very quickly, and it matched at all 13, and then that generated the arrest warrant.
The man who actually raped and murdered Deborah Sykes was Anthony Brown's older brother, Willard. Confronted with the DNA evidence, he confessed, and Darrell Hunt, after 19 years, was finally set free.
With the consent of both parties, we will dismiss this case with prejudice.
But to some, even a wonderful end can't justify the means.
If the measure of reasonableness is going to be, we got the right guy, then every search is going to be reasonable. In the name of solving crimes, let's just start going around and kicking down doors and issuing general search warrants for high crime neighborhoods and randomly searching and seizing people, because you know what? We're going to solve a lot of crime. No doubt, that will be a benefit. But what's the cost?
I know that there's people that talk about privacy rights in this, but I think of two things. One is the victims. There'll be more victims if this person is not caught. And the other is the person that could be falsely accused and sitting in prison.
Just weeks ago, the city of Winston-Salem offered Hunt an apology and $1.65 million to compensate him for his years in prison. From his office overlooking the old county courthouse, he now works to help other former inmates re-enter society, and he's thankful that North Carolina isn't a state where a partial DNA match can't be pursued.
If it wasn't for this, then I wouldn't be here.
A documentary about Darrell Hunt, The Trials of Darrell Hunt, will appear later this month on HBO. And the FBI has agreed to try for a while, leaving it up to the states to decide whether to share information with one another in the event of a partial match. The Denver DA is hoping that'll help solve his 3 rape cases.